roughly 40% of mushrooms exported from Canada make their way to the United States. Starting May 18, 2026, these deliveries are now subject to new tariffs. However, the percentage that truly counts here is not 40%, it is 100%. The legal strategy Washington just applied to Canadian mushrooms might one day be used against nearly every farming system across North America. This is what makes the situation extremely concerning. This issue does not involve steel, aluminum, oil infrastructure, lumber disputes, or automotive components. We are discussing everyday mushrooms, including button varieties, criminis, and portobellos, the type found in supermarket refrigerators, selling for just a few dollars per package. Still, the U.S. Department of Commerce has labeled typical Canadian agricultural tax breaks, policies similar to those applied across modern farming, even within the U.S. itself, as potentially unlawful subsidies. By doing so, Washington might have built a legal structure that other nations could someday apply against American farmers as well. This is not a political overstatement, it involves trade regulations, and grasping what actually occurred is essential. On May 13, 2026, the Commerce Department released an initial countervailing duty decision targeting fresh mushroom imports coming from Canada. The inquiry covered the entire 2024 calendar year. Particular tariff percentages were given to multiple exporters. Champs Fresh Farms was hit with a 1.62% duty. Farmers Fresh Mushrooms faced a 4.97% rate. Other Canadian exporters received a wider 2.84% rate. These tariffs officially began on May 18. Initially, these percentages appear modest, compared to 50% duties on steel and aluminum, or substantial charges on lumber. A 2.84% mushroom tariff seems quite minor, but the rate itself is not the main issue. The legal reasoning supporting it is what matters. This case started following a petition from the Fresh Mushrooms Fair Trade Coalition, a U.S. advocacy organization representing multiple mushroom growers, mostly located in Pennsylvania, the largest mushroom-producing state in the country. Their claim was highly focused. Canadian mushroom producers, they argued, were gaining unfair advantages through government subsidies. And what precisely qualified as these unfair subsidies? Loans issued by Farm Credit Canada, a clean technology investment tax credit, and most significantly, provincial sales tax exemptions on agricultural equipment in British Columbia. That final detail is where everything shifts. If a wide-reaching sales tax exemption on farming machinery can now be considered an unfair subsidy under trade regulations, the effects reach well beyond mushrooms or even Canada. To grasp why, you must understand the legal tool being applied. This decision operates under what is known as a countervailing duty or CVD. According to US trade regulations, countervailing duties are meant to counteract foreign government subsidies that provide imported products an unfair cost advantage. However, the regulation includes a crucial condition. The subsidy must be specific, meaning it should focus on a certain industry, business, or identified category. It is not meant to cover general policies accessible across a whole economy or agricultural field. Farming throughout North America relies heavily on government assistance frameworks, tax relief options, financing initiatives, and policy incentives. The U.S. agricultural sector alone creates more than $1 trillion in yearly output. Canada ships tens of billions worth of agricultural goods annually, with the United States being its biggest buyer. These systems are deeply connected, and the mushroom sector itself demonstrates how interlinked the market is. A single Ontario operation, Carlton Mushroom Farms, yields approximately 300,000 pounds of mushrooms weekly. Its owner cautioned that stricter U.S. regulations could overwhelm the Canadian domestic market with excess supply, pushing prices downward and destabilizing domestic producers. This is how tariffs spread harm. They seldom remain limited to the initial target. Instead, they trigger ripple effects throughout supply networks, pricing frameworks, and regional economies. Right now, North American agriculture is already facing stress before any wider escalation even starts. More than 9 American mushroom operations have already shut down during this wider period of trade friction. Industry spokespeople inside the United States contend that once domestic farms vanish, they seldom come back. Therefore, even from the American perspective, these tariffs are being presented as safeguarding a challenged industry. Yet the legal approach being applied to deliver that protection could generate consequences much wider than the mushroom sector alone. The Commerce Department has not completed its work yet. A separate anti-dumping inquiry is still proceeding alongside, with a final decision expected no later than September 28, 2026. If that judgment also returns affirmative, A second layer of duties might be stacked on top of current tariffs. That is significant because the same legal reasoning would broaden with it. Now position that schedule next to another one, July 1, 2026. That is the deadline linked to the USMCA review procedure. Canada, the United States, and Mexico are nearing one of the most important trade negotiations in recent decades. Canada might now step into those discussions right after being informed that standard agricultural tax breaks could be classified as actionable subsidies under U.S. trade regulations. That alters the negotiating climate significantly, especially once you realize the extent of agricultural assistance already embedded in the American framework itself. The U.S. federal government is expected to deliver approximately $55 billion in direct assistance to American farmers during 2026 alone. Not loans but direct payments. The USDA verified it. Regular farm initiatives make up more than $44 billion. Then another program called the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program added an additional $12 billion in one-time disbursements. Corn growers, soybean farmers, wheat producers, cotton cultivators, receiving billions of dollars flowing straight into American agriculture. Some payments are linked to land area, others back commodity pricing or income steadiness. Now, use the mushroom ruling's legal reasoning with those figures. If a provincial sales tax break on Canadian farming equipment can be labeled an unfair subsidy, what precisely are direct cash transfers from the federal government? What about federally backed crop insurance or accelerated depreciation regulations permitting farmers to immediately write off large equipment acquisitions? These represent various types of government backing. This is why trade attorneys are watching this case so closely. Once one nation broadens the definition of what counts as an actionable subsidy, other nations can start using the same logic in return. William Pellerin, a trade attorney in Ottawa, noted that the U.S. farm lobby remains enormously influential politically. The wider pattern inside the Trump administration seems increasingly aimed at targeting agricultural imports wherever political pressure appears. Historical precedent exists for precisely this kind of escalation. The softwood lumber conflict between Canada and the United States has continued for decades. Washington repeatedly claimed that Canadian provincial stumpage arrangements, the charges paid to harvest timber on public land, represented unfair subsidies. Canada contested those tariffs repeatedly through NAFTA panels, WTO challenges, and trade tribunals. In many instances, Canada prevailed. The duties frequently stayed in place regardless. But the mushroom case brings something potentially wider. Softwood stumpage arrangements are industry-focused. Farm tax exemptions accessible across a whole agricultural sector are not. This is the crucial difference. Under WTO regulations, subsidies usually must be targeted at a specific enterprise or sector to qualify for countervailing duties. A wide tax policy open to every farmer in a province does not fit that standard neatly. If this mushroom ruling survives final review, many trade specialists believe it might establish a precedent, redefining what qualifies as a subsidy, not only for mushrooms but for agriculture more generally. This is why the consequences reach well beyond Canada. The United States exported nearly $200 billion in agricultural goods during 2024. American farmers operate as global exporters. Soybeans head to Asia, corn moves to Latin America, wheat, beef, dairy, and produce enter markets globally. Foreign governments may now examine Washington's mushroom ruling and recognize they have received a legal structure they can potentially use against American farm assistance programs as well. Ryan Kuslag from Mushrooms Canada expressed it clearly. If the United States classifies tax exemptions as countervailable subsidies, other nations can start applying the same approach to the United States. This is how trade escalation operates. Every legal strategy one government uses eventually becomes accessible to all others. The extent of American farm backing makes this vulnerability massive. The United States runs one of the biggest agricultural assistance systems worldwide. Conservation initiatives, commodity backing mechanisms, crop insurance subsidies, marketing help, trade promotion funding, and direct financial aid. Billions upon billions of dollars connected to maintaining American agriculture competitive. Using the legal reasoning now being tested in the mushroom case, many of these initiatives could suddenly become open to challenge. The timing could not be more complicated. The mushroom tariff decision came on May 13, 2026. The USMCA review deadline comes July 1. That allowed less than 2 months between a significant new agricultural trade conflict and one of the most critical North American trade negotiations in decades. Formal discussions between Canada and the United States had still not completely started in any organized manner. Meanwhile, Mark Carney had already been openly contending that Canada needed to diversify portions of its economy away from relying on the American market. Ottawa even lifted many retaliatory tariffs on USMCA-compliant American goods as a goodwill action before negotiations. Then just weeks before the review deadline, Washington imposed mushroom tariffs based on a legal claim that essentially informed Canada even routine agricultural tax policies might become targets under U.S. trade regulations. This shifts the negotiating setting instantly. If wide agricultural tax treatment can now be challenged as an actionable subsidy, Canada steps into USMCA review discussions, knowing nearly every element of its farm support framework could theoretically face examination. Meanwhile, food inflation is already putting stress on consumers in both nations. Canadian food costs are expected to keep rising substantially through 2026. American grocery expenses are under strain as well. Energy expenses, fertilizer costs, supply chain interruptions, Middle East instability affecting agricultural inputs. Tomato prices in the United States jumped sharply earlier this year. Produce inflation stays unpredictable. This is the context against which Washington chose to impose tariffs on Canadian mushrooms. Then there is the international legal dimension. The WTO Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, commonly called the SCM Agreement, sets out the worldwide regulations governing countervailing duties. Under these regulations, subsidies usually become actionable only when they are targeted at a specific enterprise or industry. This specificity condition is one of the core protections stopping trade law from being turned into a weapon against ordinary government policy. A provincial sales tax exemption accessible to every farmer in British Columbia does not fit clearly into that category. It applies widely across agriculture, including canola growers, dairy producers, vegetable farms, and mushroom growers alike. This is why many trade attorneys believe Canada would have a strong case if this conflict eventually reaches the WTO. The organization has repeatedly decided that broad government policies accessible across sectors do not automatically qualify as countervailable subsidies. Canada has successfully contested US trade actions previously on similar grounds. If Canada prevails again, the decision could create an important precedent safeguarding standard agricultural tax policies from future countervailing duty claims. But WTO disputes require years. The USMCA review deadline comes in weeks. Businesses are not waiting for legal certainty before responding. Food distributors are already looking for extra financing to prepare for potential tariff exposure. Farmers are handling fertilizer prices that have surged dramatically. Input expenses are climbing throughout North American agriculture. Those costs eventually reach grocery shelves. Even former USDA economists have cautioned that food inflation pressures connected to geopolitical instability and supply chain interruptions may persist well into 2027. Tariffs merely add another layer of pressure on top of an already stretched system. This is why this mushroom case matters far beyond mushrooms themselves. It sits at the crossroads of trade law, food inflation, agricultural politics, and the future framework of North American economic relations. Depending on how the final decision develops later in 2026, it could become either a limited dispute or the foundation for a much wider agricultural trade conflict. At the strategic level, there are actually two ways to understand the mushroom tariff. The first perspective is the narrow one. A group of mushroom producers in Pennsylvania felt Canadian competition was damaging their industry. They filed a petition with the Commerce Department, and the administration responded by providing protection. Simple, limited, a single industry conflict. However, the second understanding is much bigger. This becomes the first significant agricultural countervailing duty case, built around wide tax policy instead of highly targeted industry backing. If the final ruling in September confirms the preliminary finding, it creates a framework that can potentially be extended into other sectors. Canadian dairy, wheat, canola, produce, and horticulture. Any agricultural industry where domestic political pressure exists could theoretically become open to similar claims. All of this is occurring just weeks before the USMCA review process reaches a crucial stage. Canada steps into those negotiations knowing ordinary farm tax policies have now been labeled by Washington as potentially actionable subsidies. That shifts the whole tone of the discussions. Mark Carney has already stated publicly that Canada needs to diversify its trade relationships instead of staying overwhelmingly reliant on the United States. Despite the trade tensions, Canada still drew enormous levels of foreign investment during 2025. Ottawa is already exploring other options. The mushroom ruling only speeds up that thinking. The irony here is hard to overlook. The tariffs are supposedly intended to protect American agriculture and strengthen domestic growers. Yet the legal framework being applied to justify them might simultaneously expose billions of dollars in American farm support initiatives to retaliatory challenges from other nations. At the same time, the dispute risks damaging the atmosphere surrounding the most critical North American trade negotiations in decades. Layered on top of all that is increasing food inflation already affecting consumers on both sides of the border. This is how trade disputes develop. The harm seldom stays limited to the original product involved. The effects expand outward through legal precedent, political retaliation, supply networks, consumer pricing, and investment choices. The mushroom tariff may seem small on the surface, but underneath it lies a much larger question. Whether standard agricultural support frameworks themselves are now becoming targets inside modern trade wars. If that occurs, the consequences will reach far beyond Canada. The United States exported nearly $200 billion in agricultural products in 2024. American farmers rely heavily on international markets. Every new legal strategy Washington uses against foreign agricultural assistance programs can eventually be directed back against American agriculture too. This is the boomerang effect many trade attorneys are now cautioning about. The real question is what comes next. If the Commerce Department's final decision later this year confirms the current understanding, Canada will almost certainly face pressure to challenge the ruling internationally. However, legal conflicts through the WTO move slowly. USMCA negotiations are occurring now. Food costs are climbing now. Investment choices are being made now. Businesses across North American agriculture are already adapting to the uncertainty before the final legal result even comes. This is why the mushroom tariff is important, not because mushrooms themselves hold strategic importance, but because the legal structure behind the tariff might reshape how governments challenge agricultural support systems across the entire continent. Once these precedents are set, reversing them becomes much more difficult than creating them in the first place.